White officer spits on black man, then discovers he's the new police chief. The humid August morning in Blue Ridge felt thick with anticipation as Sam Carter, the newly appointed police chief, parked his worn-down sedan outside the precinct. The parking lot bustled with uniformed officers exchanging casual banter, drinking coffee, and preparing for another routine day. None of them knew who he was, and that was precisely his intention. Dressed in faded jeans, a plaid shirt, and scuffed sneakers, Sam hardly looked the part of a man who had spent over 2 decades in law enforcement, let alone their new commanding officer. He wanted to see them as they truly were, away from the stiff formalities of an official introduction. His experience had taught him that scheduled welcomes and rehearsed meetings never showed the real culture of a department. And in Blue Ridge, where reports of misconduct and deep-rooted bias had reached his desk long before his arrival, Sam needed to see the truth, not a polished version of it. With a steadying breath, he adjusted his baseball cap and strode toward the side entrance. The sharp scent of stale coffee and disinfectant hit him as he stepped inside. The precinct was alive with the usual chaos, ringing phones, shuffling paperwork, and the murmur of conversations that ranged from police business to weekend plans. As Sam walked slowly through the station, his sharp eyes scanned the interactions around him. Some officers worked diligently, heads down, focused. Others leaned back at their desks, cracking jokes, their laughter echoing off the dull beige walls. It was a normal scene, one he had seen in precincts before. But he wasn't here for normal. He was here to find the ugly side, the side that didn't expect to be watched. That moment came faster than he expected. "Hey, you." A voice, loud and sharp, cut through the noise. The room stilled slightly, heads turning just enough to watch what was about to unfold. Officer Brian Kincaid, a burly white officer with a squared jaw and an unmistakable air of arrogance, strode toward Sam. Behind him, a few others leaned casually against the walls, smirking. "This isn't a shelter. You lost?" Kincaid sneered, his eyes sweeping over Sam's appearance, dismissing him immediately as someone who didn't belong. Sam, keeping his demeanor calm, started to respond, but Kincaid wasn't interested in an answer. "Didn't you hear me? I said get the hell out of here. We don't need people like you hanging around," Kincaid said, his voice dripping with condescension. Sam's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. He had seen this before, the unearned confidence of men who had never been challenged. A few officers chuckled from across the room, nudging each other. They thought this was entertainment. Then, in an act of pure, unchecked audacity, Kincaid spat, a thick glob landing on Sam's cheek. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed immediately by silence. Even those who had laughed a moment ago froze, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The air thickened with tension, as if everyone suddenly realized they were standing on a cliff's edge, moments away from a fall that could not be undone. Sam took a slow breath. The warm saliva slid down his cheek, but he did not react. Instead, he reached into his pocket, retrieved a handkerchief, and wiped his face with slow, deliberate movements. His every motion was controlled, his silence more powerful than any shouted response. The room watched, waiting, for him to lash out, for him to snap, for him to fit into the version of him they expected. But he did none of those things. Instead, he asked, his voice level, "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Kincaid smirked, crossing his arms. "Only the ones who don't belong here." More laughter, though now it felt uncertain, uneasy. The moment had stretched too long, had turned into something else, something dangerous. Sam said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked away, moving down the hallway toward the briefing room. Then, over the intercom, a voice crackled to life. "All personnel to the briefing room. The new chief is here." The officers, still chuckling, barely registered the announcement at first. They were too caught up in their own amusement. In the power play, they thought they had won. But Kincaid, mid-laugh, stiffened. Something cold and uncertain flickered across his face. Sam Carter kept walking, never turning back. The real show was about to begin. The briefing room buzzed with idle chatter, the usual morning ritual of officers swapping weekend stories, griping about paperwork, and sipping lukewarm coffee from stained precinct mugs. Officer Brian Kincaid, still basking in the amusement of his earlier confrontation, leaned back in his chair with a smug grin. The new chief was arriving today, but as far as he was concerned, it was just another bureaucrat, another suit with big ideas and no real-world experience. He'd seen chiefs come and go, each one making promises about change, none of them sticking around long enough to follow through. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the man he had spat on just minutes ago was about to walk into this room and redefine everything they thought they knew about power. At the front of the room, Captain Robert Harris, an older officer with a graying mustache and a reputation for running a tight ship, cleared his throat. "All right, settle down, people. We've got an important introduction today." The chatter died down just enough for curiosity to settle in. A few officers glanced toward the door, waiting for their new leader to stroll in, probably some over-decorated, out-of-touch administrator. Captain Harris continued, "As most of you know, Chief Caldwell retired last month. We've been waiting for his replacement, and I'm pleased to introduce our new leader, a man with an impressive record and a vision for this department." At that moment, Sam Carter stepped forward. The room fell silent. Every conversation, every movement, every whispered joke ceased as the officers processed the sight before them. There was a beat of stunned recognition, a collective intake of breath as those who had been in the hallway moments earlier felt the ground beneath them shift. The man they had mocked, the man they had spat on, was now standing at the podium, his very presence commanding the room. Kincaid's smirk evaporated. His spine stiffened, his arms uncrossing involuntarily as his body registered what his mind refused to process. Sam didn't rush. He moved with purpose, his calm and controlled demeanor amplifying the weight of the moment. He reached the lectern, placed a folder with the precinct's official seal on top, and slowly scanned the room. His eyes settled on Kincaid for a beat longer than the others, just long enough to make his point without a single word spoken. Then, in a voice measured but unwavering, he delivered the blow that shattered the illusion. "Good morning, my name is Samuel Carter. As of today, I am your new chief of police." The air thickened. A few officers shifted in their seats. Others swallowed hard. Some exchanged nervous glances, silently asking if they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. But Kincaid? Kincaid looked like a man staring at a loaded gun aimed squarely at his chest. His jaw tightened, his Adam's apple bobbed, and for the first time in a long time, he had nothing to say. Sam let the silence stretch, let them sit in it, let them absorb the weight of their actions. Then he continued, his voice carrying through the room with controlled precision. "I arrived this morning, without announcement, without uniform, without rank, because I wanted to see this department for what it really is, not the polished version that's presented in official reports." A murmur rippled through the room, uncertainty creeping in. "And what I witnessed," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "was eye-opening." Another silence, heavier this time. Kincaid shifted in his seat. The sweat beading on his forehead was a stark contrast to the smug arrogance he had displayed just moments ago. Sam took a step forward, his eyes sweeping across the room. "Let me make one thing clear," he said. "The culture that has been allowed to fester here, it ends today." The room bristled. Officers glanced at each other, some with thinly veiled resentment, others with a growing realization that things were about to change. Then Sam's eyes landed on Kincaid. "Officer Kincaid." A single breath escaped the room. Kincaid's fingers curled into fists. He knew what was coming. Sam took another step forward, his voice never rising, yet somehow echoing in every corner of the room. "You represent everything that is broken in this department." Kincaid flinched, but Sam didn't stop. "When you spat in my face this morning, you weren't just disrespecting me." His voice hardened, his jaw set. "You disrespected the badge, the oath, and the community we swore to protect." Kincaid's mouth opened as if to offer an excuse, but no words came. There were no excuses that would work now. "I didn't know," Kincaid stammered, his confidence fracturing before everyone's eyes. Sam nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's exactly the problem, Officer Kincaid." The room was a pressure cooker, ready to explode. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know. Sam continued, his voice sharper now. You didn't stop to ask. You didn't hesitate to humiliate a man you assumed had no power. And that assumption? He let the silence stretch. That assumption is exactly why this department has lost the trust of the community it serves. Kincaid's face burned crimson, his entire body rigid as the weight of his actions settled onto his chest like a boulder. Sam turned, addressing the entire room now. What I witnessed this morning wasn't just one man's mistake. His voice cut through the silence, sharp and unrelenting. It was a culture. A culture where bullying and prejudice are not just tolerated but celebrated. Then, with finality, and that stops now. The words slammed into the room like a hammer against steel. A few officers shifted uncomfortably, others looked down, suddenly very interested in their shoes. Then, Sam delivered the final blow. Effective immediately, Officer Kincaid is suspended, pending an internal investigation. A collective gasp rippled through the precinct. Kincaid looked like he had been punched in the gut. Sam didn't flinch. And for those of you who think this is just a slap on the wrist, his eyes swept the room, his tone unapologetically firm. Think again. This is the first of many changes, and if you're not ready to rise to a higher standard, then this? He gestured to the precinct around them. This isn't the place for you. The room sat in stunned silence. The meeting ended without its usual chatter. No laughter, no smug remarks, just the crushing realization that the man standing before them wasn't here to play games. Sam Carter turned toward Captain Harris. Let's get to work. The weight of Sam Carter's words still hung in the air like a thick fog. The precinct had been shaken to its core, and every officer knew it. There was no room for the old ways anymore, not under this new leadership. But for Sam, delivering that wake-up call was only the beginning. He had no illusions about how deep the rot had settled within these walls. He had spent years confronting corruption in law enforcement, and he knew that real change didn't come from speeches. It came from action, and action was exactly what he had planned. That morning, as Sam walked the halls of the precinct, the air was noticeably different. Conversations hushed as he passed by. Some officers straightened their posture, while others avoided his gaze entirely. The nervous energy was palpable, the reality of accountability suddenly hitting them in ways they hadn't anticipated. One officer, a young recruit named Daniel Reyes, approached cautiously. Chief Carter, he said, his voice laced with uncertainty. Sam stopped, offering a nod. Officer Reyes? Reyes swallowed, clearly choosing his next words carefully. I just wanted to say, I've seen a lot of things since I started here. Things I knew weren't right, but I didn't know how to speak up. I was afraid. Sam studied him for a moment before responding. You were afraid of the culture, he said simply. Afraid of retaliation, afraid of being labeled as a problem. Reyes exhaled, relieved that he didn't have to spell it out. Yes, sir. Sam gave him a measured look. Are you still afraid? Reyes hesitated, but then squared his shoulders. No, sir. I want to do better. I want to help change things. That was what Sam needed to hear. Good, he said, his tone firm. Because we don't just need officers who do their jobs. We need officers who stand up when something isn't right. You have that opportunity now. Reyes nodded, a flicker of determination crossing his face before he returned to his duties. It was small, but it was a start. But not everyone was so quick to embrace the change. As Sam reached his office, Captain Harris was already waiting inside, arms crossed, an unreadable expression on his face. Chief, Harris greeted, closing the door behind them. Sam took a seat, gesturing for Harris to do the same. Something on your mind, Captain? Harris exhaled through his nose. The officers are rattled, and I can't say I blame them. Kincaid's suspension sent a message. Sam leaned forward. That was the point. Harris gave a knowing nod. I get it, I do. And between you and me, Kincaid had it coming. But you and I both know that he wasn't acting alone. This precinct has been running on the same old playbook for years. You could suspend a dozen officers tomorrow, and it still wouldn't be enough to fix it. Sam's jaw tightened. Then we start with something stronger. Harris furrowed his brow. Stronger? Sam pulled out a file and slid it across the desk. I've been looking at internal reports since I got here. Complaints, misconduct records, most of them buried, ignored, or written off as unsubstantiated. I want a full audit of this department, starting now." Harris's eyes widened slightly, his fingers grazing the edge of the file. "You do this, and you're going to have half the precinct fighting you." "Then they can leave," Sam replied without hesitation. "I'm not here to make friends, Harris. I'm here to make sure this department actually serves its community. And if there are officers who see accountability as a threat, then they were never meant to wear the badge in the first place." Harris sighed, rubbing his temple. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious." There was a long pause before Harris nodded slowly. "All right, Chief, I'll get started on the audit." As Harris stood to leave, Sam added, "And Captain?" Harris turned back. "Start with Kincaid's old cases. I have a feeling we're going to find more than a few skeletons there." Harris gave a grim nod before exiting the office. Sam leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He knew what was coming next. Resistance. Backlash. The old guard digging their heels in, unwilling to let go of the power they had abused for years. But that was fine. He was ready for war. The precinct's foundation had been cracked, and now it was time to break it open completely. Sam Carter knew that real change wasn't just about making bold statements. It was about proving that the old ways could no longer stand. That morning, as he walked into the conference room, a thick tension hung in the air. Officers sat around the long table, some staring straight ahead, others exchanging uncertain glances. Captain Harris was at the front, flipping through a thick folder, one that held years of ignored complaints, questionable arrests, and misconduct reports that had never been addressed. Sam took his seat at the head of the table and placed his hands on the desk, his expression unreadable. "We have a problem," he began, his voice steady but sharp. "And before any of you think this is about one bad officer or one mistake, let me make something clear. This is about all of us." A few officers stiffened in their chairs, and Sam saw Kincaid's former partner, Officer Monroe, shift uncomfortably. "We're going to talk about cases that should have been reviewed years ago," Sam continued. "Cases that never made it past the front desk because someone decided they weren't worth pursuing. Cases where officers abused their authority and walked away without consequences." Harris cleared his throat and opened the file in front of him. "We started the audit as ordered, Chief. The results?" He hesitated, glancing at Sam before shaking his head. "They speak for themselves." He began reading off names, unjustified stops, excessive force complaints, falsified reports. One after another, names of officers in the room were called out. Officers who had long thought themselves untouchable. Sam watched their faces, their composure cracking as the walls closed in. Finally, Harris stopped at one case. "This one stood out the most," he said, tapping a page. "A man named Jamal Evans, arrested 5 years ago for resisting arrest. According to the report, he was combative. Officers used necessary force to subdue him. But that's not the full story." The room fell into silence as Harris handed Sam a USB drive. Sam plugged it into the laptop at the center of the table. A grainy body cam video filled the screen. The footage showed Evans on the ground, hands raised, unarmed. He wasn't resisting, he was pleading. Then came the kicks, the punches, the taunts from the officers standing over him. And then, Officer Monroe, grinning as he turned off his body cam. Sam let the video play until the screen went black. The room was frozen. Officer Monroe's face had gone pale. "Chief, that's not what it looks like." Sam slammed his fist on the table, his patience gone. "No, it's exactly what it looks like." His voice was cold, furious. "And you're going to answer for it." This wasn't just about cleaning house anymore. This was a reckoning. The room remained deathly quiet, the weight of the footage still pressing against every officer's chest like a boulder. Sam Carter let the silence linger, making sure each and every person in that room felt it. The truth had been laid bare, and now there was no turning back. Officer Monroe, the man in the footage, sat rigid in his chair, his knuckles white as he gripped the table. Beads of sweat formed on his brow, and his jaw clenched as if he were holding back an excuse, a lie, a desperate attempt to spin what they had all just seen. Sam leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his stare unwavering. "Tell me, Monroe," he said, his voice dangerously low. "If we hadn't pulled that footage, if we hadn't reviewed that case, Would you have ever spoken up? Monroe swallowed hard. Chief, it was years ago. Things were different then. Sam slammed a file onto the table, cutting him off. Spare me, because here's what's not different. Accountability. You don't get to hide behind time. You don't get to rewrite history just because you don't like the way it looks now. A murmur rippled through the room. Some officers shifted uncomfortably. Others sat stone-faced, watching, waiting. I've got two choices, Sam continued, his voice sharp as steel. I can pretend this is just one officer's mistake, fire Monroe, let him take the fall while the rest of you keep your heads down, hoping I don't dig deeper. He stood, glancing around the table, locking eyes with each officer who had been complicit in silence. Or, he let the word hang in the air, letting its weight settle. We start telling the truth, not just about Monroe, but about this entire department. The reaction was immediate. A few younger officers, those new to the force, those who hadn't yet been swallowed whole by the culture of silence, exchanged uncertain glances. A veteran officer, Sergeant Hale, exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Finally, Officer Reyes, one of the few who had come to Sam privately with concerns about the department's toxic environment, spoke. Chief, if we speak out, if we start exposing this, won't it destroy us? Sam met her gaze. No, Reyes, staying silent is what destroys us. He looked around once more, reading the uncertainty, the fear, the unspoken plea for someone to finally lead them in the right direction. This is your chance, Sam said. Tell me everything. I'm done asking. The room held its breath. And then, one by one, officers began to speak. The tension in the precinct had reached a boiling point. Ever since Chief Sam Carter had started implementing changes, the atmosphere had been divided. Those who wanted to do better and those who saw him as a threat. The old guard, officers who had been entrenched in the department's culture for decades, resented the way their routines had been disrupted. No more overlooked complaints. No more unchecked power. No more silence. The biggest source of that resistance? Sergeant Greg Monroe. He had been with the department for over 20 years and wore his badge like a shield against accountability. He sat at the back of the morning briefing, arms crossed, his scowl permanently etched into his face. The officers who still clung to the old ways looked to him, their unspoken leader, in defiance. Monroe knew it. He thrived on it. And Chief Carter? He wasn't backing down. Let's talk about last night's incident, Carter said, his voice sharp as he addressed the room. The one where a citizen was unlawfully detained and humiliated on the street for no apparent reason other than an officer's personal bias. His eyes scanned the room. He didn't need to name names. They all knew who he was talking about. Monroe let out a loud scoff, shaking his head. Chief, are we seriously doing this? We're out there risking our necks every day, but suddenly, we're the bad guys? Carter stepped forward, the room watching in silence. You're the bad guys when you make yourselves the bad guys, Sergeant. The moment you decide your authority gives you the right to treat people like dirt, you stop being an officer of the law and start being part of the problem. A murmur rippled through the officers. Some sat up straighter, others exchanged wary glances. Monroe, however, smirked. You can't just come in here and change everything overnight. Some of us actually know how this job works. Carter stared him down. Clearly, you don't. Because if you did, you'd understand that respect is not a weakness. It's the foundation of this uniform. Monroe's smirk faded. For the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Carter let the silence stretch before speaking again. This department is changing, and you have two options. Be part of the solution or get out of the way. But make no mistake, change is happening, whether you like it or not. Monroe said nothing. The silence said enough. The room sat on edge, waiting for Monroe to push back. But for the first time, he didn't. And just like that, the tides had begun to shift. Months had passed since Chief Sam Carter took over the precinct, and while change had begun, the battle was far from over. The old guard was still present, but their influence was waning. Officers who once laughed at misconduct now hesitated before engaging in the same behavior. Some left, unwilling to adapt. Others, like Sergeant Greg Monroe, stayed, but with caution. The real victory wasn't just in disciplining bad cops. It was in winning over those who could still be redeemed. One evening, as Carter was preparing to leave for the night, he heard a knock on his office door. It was Monroe. The same man who had resisted him at every turn, who had spat at the idea of reform, now stood hesitantly at the doorway. "Chief," Monroe said, shifting on his feet, I wanted to talk." Carter set his briefcase down, nodding for him to enter. "What's on your mind, Sergeant?" Monroe hesitated before speaking. "I've been thinking, a lot, about everything that's happened, about how I've handled things." He let out a heavy breath. "I don't want to be that guy anymore." Carter studied him for a long moment. "That's a good start, but words aren't enough, Monroe. You have to prove it." Monroe nodded. "I know, and I want to." His voice carried something it never had before, humility. For the first time since his arrival, Carter saw something different in Monroe's eyes. Not defiance, not resistance, but the smallest glimmer of regret, of growth. "You've got a long road ahead of you," Carter said finally. "But if you're serious about making things right, I'm willing to meet you halfway." Monroe nodded again, this time with more certainty. "Then let's get to work." Carter extended a hand. For a moment, Monroe hesitated. Then, slowly, he shook it. And just like that, a new chapter began, not just for Monroe, but for the entire precinct.